always delete.
Yeah, we can always delete stuff off.
You can always delete what you don't want in any of this stuff too, huh?
Yep. Okay. So Fred, thanks for joining me. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Brian. It's wonderful to be here with you. Been looking forward to this.
It's great to have you here, and I'm glad we finally, got a chance to meet face to face and talk for a few minutes down in Fort Worth a couple weeks ago. That was really awesome. It's always a privilege to be able to hear you talk, do one of your keynote addresses. And something somebody told me the other day when I brought up that I was going to be doing this interview with you was just let him go, because he loves to chase rabbit holes. So just let him go chase rabbit holes that he can't chase when he's got, just a 1 hour time slot to fill. So I hope we'll find a couple of those today.
Well, I'm sure we will, Brian. Between you and I, we'll find some to chase down.
So I've been hearing your name for a long time. My dad has been a big fan of your work for a long time. And I'll have to admit, I just started into Nourishment a few days ago, and I'm an audiobook consumer. So one of the big questions I have is, when are you going to narrate your own audiobooks?
Your timing actually couldn't be better on that. When the pandemic started, the folks at Chelsea Green asked me if I would be interested in doing an audio book.
And that's your publisher?
Yes, Chelsea Green is a publisher, and there's Fern Bradley Marshall is the lady I worked with that I edited with, and she raised the idea, and at the time, I don't know why, but it didn't sound so interesting to me, but I didn't say no at all. And then as time went on, I think in part I was working on a couple other projects and didn't feel like I had the time, but as time went on, sounded like more and more of a good idea. And so finally got into it and put together a narrative for, it's an adaptation of the book, actually. The book, I think, I was visiting with Ben Trollinger, who's editing this narration. And I think he was saying the book's about 186,000 words. This narration is 75,000 words. So I about cut the book in half, basically.
Okay.
And to try to stick with the big points, to try to stick with the main themes that are in the book, not bog it down in too much detail. There's a lot of particulars that are in the book, in Nourishment, and a lot of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, and a lot of reference material that's cited in there. So this audio rendition is much more big picture in that sense. Ben was very happy with the narration. In fact, he's going to send, well, I just saw in the email, he just sent me his comments on it, and he's wanting me to have that back to him in about 10 days. He said it's going to be no problem. So we're moving ahead on that. Audiobook will be out fairly soon, actually. And this is stuff you can delete if you don't want talking about. But what I'm trying to convince those guys to do is, let's put music with it. Let's have a couple different people, me maybe doing some of the narration, but a real live narrator doing some of it. And let's make it come alive. Let's use those different mediums to make it come alive. And Ben was really, really receptive today to doing that. Now, whether or not the people that say yes on those or no on those kind of things go for it, we'll see. But I think there's so many ways to make things come alive, and music is powerful. And I think having more than one voice in there can be powerful if it's done in a good way. So that's a lot more probably than what you wanted on that book, but that's where we're going. And I'm excited about it now. I'm excited. I haven't looked at the script since I turned it over. I just set it aside, so I'll be able to look with fresh eyes here over the next week to 10 days as I go through Ben's comments. And so we're working on it. And I think I liked also, there's some points. There's 5 sections to the book. Dining with change, dancing with the wisdom of the body, savoring the artist's palate, grappling with uncertainty, fading into mystery. And then there's a last part that's dining on earth, a visitor's reflections. What I wanted to write the book about are those last sections, grappling with uncertainty, fading into mystery, and a visitor's reflections on being on this planet. But I felt like needed the first 3 sections to set the stage for those last sections. This audiobook is way more balanced in terms of really hitting those last sections pretty hard. I think, they're to me, well, I think all of the book is worthwhile. Of course, what would I say? But I think it's all worthwhile. Those first 3 sections, but I think without those last 3 sections, it's not the same book. And the balance that's in there now with those 3 sections, I think, and I was very, very happy to hear Ben's comments without me egging him on in any way about the balance and the shift in balance that's come from the book that you're reading and this audio version of the book.
So I want to know what drove you to write the book. But before we get into that, so you're Dr. Fred Provenza from the University of Utah, right?
Utah State University.
Utah State.
Yeah, University of Utah's in Salt Lake City, and that's a common mistake that people make. Which Utah State's in Logan. It's the state land grant college.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. So, how did you get where you're at? Like, where did you come from, and what has been your life? Like, tell me your life story. Briefly.
It doesn't take long. I've really been blessed, I think. But my wife asked me an interesting question a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago. She said, did you have expectations of your life? Did you have any expectations of your life? And I could truly tell her, no, I didn't have any expectations at all. What happened for me was just following things that fascinated me. And from when I was a teeny little kid, I loved wild things. If it moved, insect, fish, bird, mammal, I was just mesmerized by it. Absolutely just loved wild creatures. I used to love to catch everything. I wanted to catch it all, So I remember all the bees and moths and stuff that would land on the flowers that my mother grew in around the place, and I'd catch them. And I remember one time my dear old grandmother, who was about 5 feet tall when she was stretched out, she was babysitting with us one time, and somehow I let all those things go in the house. And so poor old Graham was up climbing on the cabinets all over. Graham, look, there's one over there. Catch that. Anyway, I was just fascinated by wild things, animals especially. Then, when it came time to go to college, it made sense to get into wildlife biology. Not that I knew anything about it, I really didn't, but wildlife sounded like something that I loved. And when I was a sophomore in college at Colorado State University, I took a class in plant taxonomy. And that just brought a world alive to me that I'd never seen before. I'd been around my mother's, she loved to grow plants and so forth, but I'd never actually really looked at wild plants, grasses, forbs, shrubs growing on rangelands until I took that class. We were required to collect 50 plant species and identify them and so forth. And I'm saying those 2 things because that interest in wild creatures and then that interest in plants led me just naturally. I loved, why do animals eat what they eat? That was really as deep as it went for me, was, just being fascinated by that. And then, pursuing that over 40 years from a research standpoint that moved from why do they eat what they eat, and why do they go where they go, to trying to understand that. How come they do that? Why do they do that? And that led to all the studies of nutritional wisdom of the body and the different ways that that works, ability to select for nutritional needs as well as for medicines and so forth. All that just evolved. And then to kind of wind around to where you started on that, when I retired 13 years ago from Utah State University, my wife and I moved to the backwoods of Colorado. We were 12 miles in on graveled road, living
the dream.
Yeah, we were, honestly. We always, from when we first met over 50 years ago, we thought, wouldn't it be cool to build your own cabin and live in the woods? We both shared that dream, but we never thought, that would actually, well, it did happen. And we were living the dream. And, but part of when we got there to the backwoods, it was like, boy, I can be like a kid again. I can, I don't want to study anything anymore. I've been there, done that. It was fantastic, but I just want to watch. I just want to sit here and watch all these plants and animals. There was every kind of wild creature, from bobcats and lynx to mountain lions to all the, pronghorns, mule deer, elk, moose, turkeys, on and on and on. It was just cool to be back there. But I thought, it would be a really nice time. And it helped with the transition of being in the middle of everything, all this activity. All of a sudden, you're 12 miles in, graveled roads, you're living alone. If there are people around, they don't know who you are, couldn't care less, actually, and better keep away. Yeah, don't want to be too nosy. But anyway, it was great to time to reflect and just to sit down and try to write down, if I was to summarize all those things that we were doing and so forth. And so that, that's a little bit about where the interest began, however that starts in a person. It was just in me. And then how I ended up winding around to the book and writing the book. And I'll add one other part. So during all the years that we were studying processes, these flavor feedback relationships, these biochemically mediated flavor feedback relationships between cells and organ systems in the palate, social learning starting in utero and early in life of what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. And then how plant diversity, those are kind of the three things that we really studied, how plant diversity influences all of that stuff. I was always thinking about humans. And a lot of times when we devise studies, we'd be thinking, well, how do we respond to this or that? And then, well, does a goat or a sheep or a cow do the same thing? So we were always thinking about that, but I had never dived into the human literature on those topics. And I thought, this would be a great chance to just see what we studied. And then, do people study those same things in people? Is there a literature related to us? And so that was a great opportunity to try. The literature on humans is like the alpha and the omega. Huh? There's no beginning and no end. It doesn't agree. You can find whatever you want to find literally out there in that literature. So, but it was a chance to really familiarize myself and to try in the book to talk not only about goats and sheep and cows and wild and bison and wild kind of creatures, but to talk about humans in that same breath as well. And it was fun to do that. It was really fun to do that. And I go back to that expectations and what Sue asked, did you have expectations? No. And I certainly would have never thought that an interest in why a cow or a goat eats what it eats would lead to talking about humans. It just all evolved, really.
And it's that simple question: why do animals eat what they eat? And we probably still don't have an answer to it. You could look at it. I can look at one of my cows eating on a willow tree and going, why does that cow eat that willow tree? Well, she wants some tannins that are in it. That's my easy answer. Okay, well, why does she want the tannins? How does she know that the tannins that she needs today are in that plant today, and that if she eats them, she'll be happy? How does she know that? Like, those are like every one of these questions that we start to challenge something that's in established knowledge opens up a whole wide world of other questions. And like you were saying, you originally started off by studying cows and wildlife and how they were making their nutritional choices through the day. And that led you to look at people. And I'm really under the impression from talking to doctors and folks in the medical field and just, people that we know in the regenerative sphere that most doctors get about like a 2-day class on nutrition, like, and it kind of sums up to, well, you put things in this end and it comes out the other end, right? I've always really wondered, and not necessarily on humans, but on cows. Like, okay, so if we can analyze everything going in, dry matter, nutrient balance, you know, carbohydrates, sugars, and everything, and then we can catch the manure and we can catch the urine, why can't we compare what's coming in the front side to what's coming out the back side and see what the cow actually used?
Yes, well, and there's a lot of studies that do that too, Brian, back in the day, of nutrient utilization and so forth. There have been a lot of work on digestion balance kind of trials, and you can imagine that there anytime you get into trials on nutrition, it gets very complex very, very quickly, as you were alluding to, because often you have to choose, what are you going to feed that? What are you going to feed that cow? And there you've already limited possibilities compared to, say, on a rangeland setting where maybe an animal has 50, 75 different foods that they'll sample and so forth. And so I'm not saying that to throw cold water or be negative, but whether you're studying a human or a cow or whatever it is, the puts animals in a box. It puts animals in a box, and you're only going to be able to draw conclusions based on the particulars of the study that you did. And so that ends up being it's a huge limitation compared to when animals are able to free range across, like, I love your background there, across an area like that, each one able to select what its body, I would argue, what its body needs. And but that's where you're so right what you say. So willow and tannin, certainly we know willows have tannins. They have salicylic acid, which we call the aspirin, right,
Yeah.
as well. And so maybe the cow has a headache that day. It's learned, we showed that animals can learn to self-medicate for multiple kind of maladies, that, like us, with, if we have a headache, we'll take an aspirin. If we have a stomach ache, we'll take Pepto-Bismol. We were showing that animals can learn to self-medicate for multiple different kind of maladies. And so I think your comment's really appropriate. When I think of the work that we did over 40 years of studying these things, I think it points in a direction. It points in a direction, but do we know every last bit about that? Not at all. We really don't. I think what it leads to is something like we're doing now. It can have an interesting conversation about all those things, Well, you think of the complexity, for instance, in meat. We're doing a bunch of studies of meat right now, and how the diversity of plants in the diet, what I would refer to as the phytochemical complexity, all these different compounds that are in plants, the hundreds, if not thousands, get into the meat, and meat itself can have 45,000 different compounds. Just imagine that, and imagine that the body knows what to do with that. It's a wisdom. When we were first starting our research, and for me, it came out of watching animals do strange things. Goats eating wood rat houses, goats avoiding eating twigs that we thought were most nutritious and eating stuff that we thought was, it's like, why are they doing that? And I always gave them credit. I always thought, they know there's something going on that we don't know. And so then we would study that. But when we started formally then into the research that occupied 40 some years, I remember writing papers and saying, somehow creatures had to be able to figure this out. Our ancestors included, we were making a living long before there were medical doctors or pharmacists or biochemists or all these things. What we're trying to do is simply, I think if we think of it from a humility standpoint, we're just trying to understand the wisdom that's in these systems and trying to think, and the whole regen movement, I think regenerative ag movement that I really appreciate, I think trying to say, well, there is this wisdom in nature and in natural systems, and we'd probably do well to try to understand and appreciate and then to manage based on some of that knowledge and wisdom.
So I've been thinking about this for a long time. Part of the problem that we're having in regenerative agriculture with explaining how some of these natural systems work and how building, soil biome and soil microbial communities, how that works, is because it's extremely difficult to study it in the lab. Like studying complexity in a lab is extremely hard because in a lab science, what you're trying to do is you're trying to eliminate all the variables that you can and just get to a control and then tweak a couple of variables to see how it responds. But in a natural system with livestock and native and plants outside, you have zero control. Like your control kind of comes down to where you want those livestock to be. Like that's the tool that I can affect. And then I just have to observe how my livestock are interacting with the grass and what they're eating. I see what they're eating. If there's no more in the pasture, okay, maybe it's time to put you in another pasture because you want to eat that and there's no more left. But I guess what I'm getting at is studying complexity. So, we kind of touched on nutritional about the balance between in and out and what the animal or organism is using. And, to some extent that's been done. There's feed trials. Okay. We can feed them this, and this, and they'll gain this much a day. Okay. That's great. That has absolutely nothing to do with anything that happens in the real world. And kind of tagging a conversation I was having with my hired hand, Keaton, the other day, the show ring, it's all fake. And to some extent, a lot of science, oh boy, I just dug myself. I just jumped in a hole there. A lot of science, it's difficult to apply in the real world in a natural system because there's so many variables.
Yes, and you didn't dig yourself into a hole at all, Brian. You're grappling with, and that's the whole point of that section of the book, grappling with uncertainty. When you get there in Nourishment, and going back to the audio adaptation of the book, I was very happy to hear what Ben was saying, how well that came across, how all these issues. And let's just take human nutrition, which was what Ben was talking about today. And what that section on grappling with uncertainty gets into is, every time you turn around, they're changing the advice, right? Are eggs good for you or bad for you? Is coffee good for you or bad for you? Is, on and on and on and on. And that grappling with uncertainty really explores what you're attempting to explore right now, the complexity of it all. And how, you start with, for one, no two individuals have ever been alike on this planet. That's amazing if you start to think about that. If you just, that no two humans, no two cows, no two anything, chipmunks, no two grass plants. And it has to do with the relationship between genes and gene expression, this whole field of epigenetics and ever-changing environments. And so there's no way anything that's amazing to me to think about that. To nature abhor, people often say nature abhors a vacuum. I say nature abhors sameness. Nature loves diversity, and
that's why all those weeds grow up in the monocrop fields.
Well, it is.
Nature wants some diversity.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And you can work yourself to death, or spray yourself to death, or however you want to. But nature abhors sameness. That it's amazing. So you run a study, and we made a point of this the last, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years of my career, of always pointing out, because in research, as you're saying, just to back up a second, you have treatments, say you have 2 treatments, and you're going to look, does the average animal do something different in one treatment versus another treatment? But what's so obvious is that within your treatment groups, even if you have statistically significant differences, the individuals are going to vary like crazy within those groups. You're going to see a great amount of variation. So we made a point always to highlight the variation, and that these individuals aren't doing the same things. I think back to the original work with goats, where we were using them as mobile pruning machines down in southern Utah to prune this shrub called blackbrush. Prune it in the winter, it stimulates all this new growth that we knew based on lab analyses was more nutritious, higher in energy, protein, minerals, and so forth. But the goats didn't want to eat it. When I say the goats didn't, that means 80 to 90% of the goats in any one trial, 10 to 20% thought it was wonderful, you know? So that's all that has implications for how nature works, right? Is a plant poisonous or not poisonous? Larkspur, for instance, is one. It's a big issue with livestock losses. People at the Poisonous Plants Lab looked at 5 different breeds of cattle, and there was more variation within a breed than there were across the different breeds in terms of their ability to tolerate the alkaloids that are in larkspur. So
I was gonna say something about that, about, that there's more differentiation from one end of the Angus breed to the other than there is between the average of all the breeds.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a really key point. That's one of the reasons that I'm thinking of a paper I just reviewed out of Australia for a nutrition journal, where they're talking about how important choices of different protein sources are, how important that is to the diet. Now that we're talking about changing climates, and we should all be eating, quote, plant-based diets and so forth. And they're making the argument that that diversity of protein sources is very important. And one of my recommendations on that paper, I think it's a really good paper. They're talking about that meat is an important part of this as well, meat and dairy kind of products. But we made that argument forever from a livestock standpoint, because no two individuals are alike. Diversity enables individuality. It enables individuals to meet their needs and to grow and produce. And so and we are going down rabbit holes, because I'm thinking back to to where we were started. But, that alone complicates any study you want to do. Then, as you were saying, you need to decide, well, which subset of foods are you going to feed? And automatically, you've reduced the universe of what's possible. And so you draw conclusions. But, an individual that's foraging for itself has so many choices, and those choices and those combination of choices matter hugely in terms of health. I remember one of your comments made me think back. You always start out naive, and I'm sure, as you were saying, still we're really naive. That's the danger. You start thinking a little bit, but
you don't know what you don't know.
Well, exactly. You don't know what you don't know. And I love Einstein's equation: ego equals 1 divided by knowledge. The more you learn. And that's what I think about as we went along. We were doing all those studies. The more we did, the more you realize everything is hooked to everything else. Whatever you're doing is linked to something else. Any choice you make, so you're running a trial to see, can cattle select for phosphorus if they're deficient in phosphorus, for example. Well, you've got to really think a lot. This is obvious, but you've got to think a lot about what's the basal diet. What am I feeding them outside of that? And that's so you want to make sure they're deficient in phosphorus and so forth. But there are nuances to that really struck me over the years. We weren't thinking about this or that or the other thing that was no doubt influencing the outcome of our studies. And we got hit with that several times, and in interesting ways that were just revelatory. It's like, oh my gosh, yeah, we should have been thinking about that. We weren't thinking about that. That was influencing the outcome. If we changed that, Now we get a different outcome to our study. So we were continually learning, but I remember one study, we were working with sheep and we were asking a question about phosphorus deficiency and could they self-select for phosphorus? And we couldn't get the group that was on the phosphorus deficient diet. We were monitoring their blood phosphorus levels to see if they were deficient, and I couldn't get their levels to drop. And we started really paying attention to what was going on. They were sticking their heads through the wire panels um, and eating the feces of sheep that were in adjacent pens that were on the phosphorus adequate diet. So they were getting their phosphorus from, and we'd never seen that. We'd never seen sheep eating feces at Green Canyon. We'd never seen them digging soil and eating it until we made them deficient.
You just freaked out every sheep guy that listens to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, and those are things that you just think, oh, that's amazing. That's really interesting. And they were becoming deficient. It caused them to try unusual things, and that's a classic deal when. Bone chewing, for instance, in cattle, that's a good sign that they are deficient in phosphorus. They're not just kind of whacked out or something. And
that wouldn't be a calcium problem?
Well, it could be calcium or phosphorus, both, and ratios of phosphorus to calcium and so forth. But some of the really neat work did tie that deficit to phosphorus, but it could be calcium too, Brian, just as you're saying, Okay.
Well, I mean, if a cow is chewing on a bone, I'd think that, well, bones are mostly calcium. That would be my first thought.
But yeah.
I haven't studied nutrition for my whole life.
Also a good source of phosphorus as well. And so, but, the further along we went, you just realize, and we were really interested in the role that mother plays in food selection. And it's amazing to watch the relationship between mother and young after birth. And so the first studies were just looking at if we trained mom to eat one food and avoid another food, would she train her lambs? And it's so obvious and so amazing when you see that. You and I are talking now, we're using words as our medium, but when you actually see something like that, we had a road show actually that traveled around for a while where we went. I remember we went over to Nevada, and A.G. Smith actually came to that one of those presentations where we were showing our trained sheep. But it was great to get people's attention because it would just blow their mind when you'd see them doing things, eating things you'd never thought they'd eat, avoiding things that you think this is ice cream plant. And then we'd simply say, well, how many ways can you think that you could get a sheep to do those kind of things, or a cow, or whatever it is? But so we'd start with mother, and we did a lot of studies like that. Then we started thinking, well, maybe cues in mother's milk, mom's eating foods and flavors get in. So then we started studying milk, and then we started thinking, well, that fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. Maybe they're even starting to learn in the womb. And so it's that kind of thing that I'm getting more specific on, where you'd see, man, and then you start thinking epigenetically, well, probably the mother of those animals and the grandmother and the great grandmother is all these linkages in time and space. And you appreciate what you're saying about the complexity of the whole thing, and how little we probably do know about the wisdom that's in nature and in all these creatures.
We talk about epigenetics a lot on this podcast, and I don't know if we've ever really kind of broken it down into what it means or what that concept kind of relates to. Could you do that for us?
Sure. I'll go down a rabbit hole here for you too, Brian.
Feet first.
So I remember writing a review paper when I was a young faculty member, and I was writing in there, and I didn't have much basis for this, but I said experiences early in life cause neurological, morphological, and physiological changes in animals. They change how they are, neurologically, morphologically, physiologically, and behaviorally. It just made sense, but I couldn't cite a ton of things. So as we went along and we were doing these experiences early in life, we would start to sacrifice animals, and we'd look at their organ systems. We'd look at rumen development, papilla development in the rumen. What's the size of the rumen? We'd look at livers and liver sizes and function. Other friends looked at kidneys and kidney function. And these experiences were changing all of those things. For instance, let's get a little specific, and then some of the work we did with the goats on blackbrush, we ran a study where we reared goats either on a high quality diet, alfalfa hay and so forth, versus just born and reared down on blackbrush. And then we looked at, when we brought the animals that were reared on the higher quality diet in another environment, when we brought them to the blackbrush, we ran trials over a couple of months. We looked at how much blackbrush they would eat. We looked at how their weight changed or not. And really, the goats that had experience ate 2.5 times more blackbrush than the naive goats. They did better weight-wise. When we gave all the goats a choice between alfalfa, which the one goats were familiar with, and blackbrush, the goats that were born and raised on blackbrush ate much more blackbrush, meal in, meal out, even if alfalfa was offered ad libitum to them. The other goats totally abandoned the blackbrush. So we were having these differences, and we were looking at organ systems and how they responded. Let me give you another example, and then let's wind it back. We have some friends in Australia who are looking at, out in Western Australia, they have a shrub called saltbrush that dominates some of their landscapes. And they were looking at rearing animals on those saltbrush range lands versus grass range lands. And they were looking in utero at those kind of what the experience did. And they showed that the sheep that were reared on saltbrush in utero, that were exposed in utero, ate significantly more saltbrush. They drank less water. They were able to perform much better on those landscapes than the animals that were naive to it. Then they started looking at kidney development, kidney function, and they were showing that had all changed for those animals. So I was working with a person. It was near the end of my career, the beginning of his career. He was trained in epigenetics, and he knew about our research. He was very familiar with the work we'd done, and I was talking to him. We were going to watch a movie actually titled Ghost in Your Genes. It's a Nova special about epigenetics. It's a fabulous. If you want people to get a primer on epigenetics, watch Ghost in Your Genes. It's riveting to me. And we were going to watch that, and I said, he was talking about the work we did, and I said, yeah, we never really studied epigenetics. And he said, yes, you did. And I really appreciated his comment, because he understood that that's what we were studying, how genes get expressed as a function of the environment that an animal is in during conception, early in life. And when I said we weren't studying epigenetics, what I meant is we weren't looking at the specific suites of genes that were being upregulated or downregulated. But I very much appreciated that he understood that what we were looking at was the outcome of that. When we looked at different organ systems in the body, and when we looked at behaviors of animals, we were looking at that gene expression and how that turns out in terms of, and it was striking when those goats, the goats that were reared on blackbrush, when we cut them open and looked inside, their rumens were enormous. They were absolutely enormous. And
Why?
You think about it, and you think if you've got a really poor quality forage, the best thing you can do is get a lot of it in there to digest, right? If you've got the goats that were reared on the higher quality diet, they had little tiny rumens because they didn't need a big rumen to digest and meet their needs. The quality was high enough.
So what are you saying when you talk about high quality forage? Because in my mind, high quality forage is something that's going to be energy intensive to grow and transport. Like,
yes.
like we're talking about like a sorghum Sudan or some wheat, corn or rye or something, right? Not
Yes.
not native pasture native plants.
Yeah, and when I say let's do clarify that. When I say high quality on that blackbrush study, it's relative. The blackbrush is a very poor quality, very fibrous, poorly digestible, um, not good source of energy or protein or minerals, And what we were comparing that with then was animals that were on a high quality alfalfa hay, grass hay ration is what and probably we had a little grain. It's been a long time ago since we did that. We probably supplemented them with a little bit of grain as well. So, they were just on a way higher plane of nutrition compared to those poor goats that were down there eking out a living on the blackbrush.
Okay. Um, so what epigenetic changes would you expect to see? Well, let me back up. So, how does the body's natural nutritional wisdom deal with these substances that now that we're eating as people and sometimes we're passing on to our livestock, these substances that short circuit the body's ability to tell you when it's had enough and to induce the feeling of satiety and satisfaction?
Yeah, that raises a really huge point, and one can think about that point from the standpoint of livestock that are offered, um, let's say on rangeland or on pasture, a diverse array of different plant species versus, say, livestock that are on a monoculture, so they don't have much choice in terms of the foods they get, or in a feedlot where they're fed a total mixed ration. Those would be three kind of degrees that I think about when it comes to livestock. From a human standpoint, I think about ultra processed foods as one end of the spectrum, and then wholesome foods at the other end of the spectrum. And I think one of the things that struck me as much as any, if we stay on the human for just a minute here, we can go back to the livestock, and I think Mark Shaxter did a wonderful job of just nailing this topic in his book, The Dorito Effect. And he makes the point that, and for those of us old enough to have experienced this, we remember that two things happened more or less simultaneously. The flavors of wholesome foods, vegetables, the varieties of different vegetables, fruits, meats as well, became blander during the last, let's say 40, 50 years. At the same time, these ultra processed foods became irresistible. And so we disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good anymore. And the food industry really figured out how to incentivize these ultra processed foods and flavorings, and with artificial flavorings and all that they do, they really figured out how to do that. And so it ended us up in a situation where this wisdom of the body that's been with us over the eons got hijacked, basically. If you have real foods, one of the points that I emphasize so much is that when a body is exposed to really nutritious foods, we like the flavors of those foods because they're good for us. That cells and organ systems, including the microbiome of the body, simply feeding back through these hormones and neurotransmitters and peptides and so forth to change our liking for the food as a function of need. And when we're on wholesome foods that are grown on good soils and good varieties of foods, phytochemically and biochemically rich varieties, that richness of flavor is our body cells and organ systems telling us this is good, we like this. On the other hand, so many of the foods nowadays look great in the store, but they have very little flavor at all. And
It's all
for
salt
anyone
and
who,
sugar.
yeah, for anyone who grows their own food, Sue and I have done that for our lifetime. when we hit the dead of winter and we don't have the stuff that we can pick fresh anymore, it's a rougher time for us. We miss that because the flavors are great. And same thing can be said with meat as well. That topic that we're doing a lot of study on nowadays, and I think in the next decade or so, going to learn a tremendous amount about how the diversity of plants in the diets of livestock really has an influence on the phytochemical and biochemical richness of meat and dairy products. That's something that people originally, for a long time, certainly we looked at ratios of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids and CLAs. But this idea that phytochemicals actually get into the meat and fat, and that they can influence, and that they can be there in concentrations that are probably meaningful, that's something that wasn't so much on the radar screen. So it's a whole area that's open to explore nowadays from a metabolomic standpoint, where you can look at the diversity of compounds that are in meat and dairy, but also from a human feeding trial standpoint, which gets into some of the complexity we were talking about earlier. But what I'm looking forward to seeing is studies where, for instance, you compare 3 meals. Let's just say we compare 3 meals that we feed to a human.
Okay.
We have one that's grown, best regen kind of practices that you can find. And there's some neat review papers are just coming out now that you may have seen too, Brian, that talking about paired farms across the country and showing that the vegetables that were grown on those are much higher in nutrients as well as these phytochemicals compared to. So let's say we have a meal where you've got vegetables and meat that's grown on really phytochemically rich, wholesome soils and so forth. And you compare that with a conventional meal that has vegetables and it has meat, but the vegetables are coming from the grocery store. They have no flavor to them. You eat them because he told you
They look pretty.
Yeah, pretty, and he told you should eat them. So you eat them, and the meat's coming from animals that are coming through the feedlot. And then let's compare those 2 meals with an ultra processed meal, a kind of Western diet. And let's look at these markers of health that people like to look at. I just reviewed another paper, a different paper that was comparing these alternative meat products that are plant-based with meat from animals coming from a feedlot. And they expected that the plant-based meats, there'd be far less inflammation following a meal, inflammatory markers. There wasn't, and the researchers were quite surprised by that. But so, a person could look at inflammation. People may or may not realize that anytime we eat a meal, there's an inflammatory response in our body. And the more wholesome the foods, the less the inflammatory response is. So one could look at markers of inflammation like these researchers did. They looked at 90 some markers. And there are many other markers that people who are way into this would recommend that we could look at. But to me, those kind of studies would be revealing in terms of the linkages between healthy soils, the plants that are grown on those soils, the animals that forage on healthy mixes of diverse mixes of plants, and then our human health as well.
So nutrient density, we're talking about nutrient density in the foods that we eat, like, and my current paradigm in my head is meat. We're talking about nutrient density of meat. So break it down. Is there a difference in the nutrient density profile, the omega-6, the omega-3 ratio between holistically raised, regeneratively grazed, grass-fed beef and typical feedlot beef?
Yes. And when it comes to ratios of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, which historically people argue we're closer to 1 with all the processed foods that we've got nowadays. You know, both omega-3 and omega-6, and this is background, you know, but just to make clear, both omega-3 and omega-6 are essential fatty acids. We need them, our body needs them, but when we get a very high ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, it can interfere with the absorption of omega-3. So they argue we need more of a balance, and that when we're on all these ultra processed foods, they have a lot of omega-6s. So back to the meat, animals that are on grain-fed diets have much higher levels of omega-6s relative to omega-3s compared to animals that are foraging on diverse mixtures of plant species. That'll come to be much more of a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's meaningful. And higher levels of conjugated linoleic acid, for instance, in animals that are foraging on
what's that do for the body
versus it's good for health and for heart health and so forth. But what we're finding is certainly the work that we're doing is supporting those that past kind of findings, but we're also finding much higher levels of various kinds of phytochemicals that are antioxidants, anti-inflammatory. They promote health, and they're in meaningful amounts and just way higher levels when animals are foraging on diverse mixtures of plant species, either on pasture or on rangeland. And let me add one qualifier here too. You know, I often talk about on rangelands, animals can eat as many as 50, 75 plant species in a day, and maybe 3 to 5 make up the bulk of the diet, but they'll pick a little bit here and a little bit there, and that's probably really meaningful in terms of their health. But you know, there's studies going on in New Zealand nowadays where they're feeding 4 to 6 plant species that are really complementary of one another and seeing huge benefits. So I add that because it's not like, well, you know, if your pasture doesn't have 50 species, you're probably going nowhere. It's to say, you know, diversity and complementarities of different species, you can get some amazing results, even with 3 to 5 6, 7 different plant species.
Good stuff. And so when you're saying phytochemicals, in my mind, I'm also hearing flavonoids and terpenes, those, you know, those compounds that give that give the food a little bit of different flavors. Like, and probably the term that most people would come up with when they hear grass-fed is gamey. And it's not gamey. Like, I don't think it's gamey. The flavors I get in my mouth from grass-fed meat, like my mind ties those to plants. Like when I'm eating that meat, I can almost see in my head what plants that cow had a lot of for the last 6 months before she went to go meet her date at freezer camp.
I love that you said that, because actually if you get really familiar with what your animals are eating and the different compounds that they contain, and you know, that's a process, and not every people don't have to do that, but it comes alive in that way that you're talking about. It makes me think of you know, I used to love to hunt blue grouse all my life, and when Sue and I were living in Utah, we used to hunt them throughout the fall and late into the fall. Early in the fall, they're eating really diverse mixtures of different kind of leaves and fruits and so forth on grasses, forbs, shrubs, but as it gets into, say, late November, the availability of those isn't so much anymore, and they move into the conifer trees. And they start to eat the needles from those trees. And actually a lot's known about grouse, and they're very selective of the trees they go into because the conifer needles are high in terpenes. So the challenge is those terpenes, if they eat too much, they can be toxic to the grouse. So the grouse has to find trees that are a good mix between the protein and energy in the tree and the amount of terpene in the tree. And that's going to vary across the environment. So the grouse are doing that, but when you shoot a grouse that time of year, it's got a subtle hint of terpene. It's just exactly what you're talking about,
Like,
you know.
you
And
could
if
taste that little piney.
yes, and it's not strong, it's not overwhelming, but definitely you can taste it, you know. And so I remember the first time I hunted them late into the fall, and I was thinking that, do I like this or don't I like this? I'm not sure. It was different, you know. It was different from the way grouse normally tasted. And I make that point because I think I totally agree with you on the gamey, and I think our palates have become dumbed down. One thing that feedlots are able to do, to say some words for pro the feedlot, you know, that they're very efficient in terms of producing animals. They've reduced the cost so that many people are able to have meat, which is huge benefit. And another thing they've done is to make things pretty uniform, right? You fairly well know what the meat's going to taste like that you're getting. Makes me think of my friend Dave Pratt when he talks about in Ranching for Profit, when he's talking about some of these kind of things. He's talking about McDonald's, and he says, you may hate McDonald's, but you know what you're going to get. You know what you're going to get every time you go there. Same with the feedlot. One of the things that I think people need to start to appreciate is what you're saying, this notion of terroir, that when I was in France several years ago, going with the shepherds up to their different places and looking at how they produce their milk and also their meat, each one was unique because of the landscape that they lived in and where the way their animals foraged. And so when you go down to the market, they may say, well, I really like Gascon's cheese. I like the flavors of his cheese better than Michel. Or so that was just an acquired preference, right? But they appreciated that flavor of the land that you were talking about, that was. And I think in a way, um, what happens with us is our palates have become dumbed down. I worked with people from around the globe over the years I was at Utah State, and a lot of times they said, your meat has no flavor. Your meat has no, we don't like your meat. It has no flavor. And what they were saying is what you're saying is that you get, you know, when they're eating this rich array of plants, you get hints of different tones, or I'm not a food flavor taster kind of guy, but you get all these different tones and things that are in that meat as a function. And if you come to appreciate that, and then to appreciate that those compounds can have health benefits in your body, then that can change your whole view of what's going on with the meat.
So how do you feel about fake meat? What's the nutritional value of fake meat to the human body?
Yeah, you know, I just, for me, it's just one more ultra processed food, one more ultra processed food. The paper I mentioned that I just reviewed, sent a
Yeah.
review.
You were talking about inflammation and fake meat. Let's go back there, chase that inflammation.
Yeah, well, they were, you know, they were trying to look at, is there value in the plant-based meats? And I don't want to be, the paper isn't out yet, and it's a follow-up to one that was published, but they you know, their hypothesis, and they say this, their hypothesis was that the plant-based meats, there'd be lower markers of inflammation. But out of these 92 markers they looked at, or 96, I forget, 92, 96, there were only 4 that showed any difference whatsoever. And in both cases, for the meat from the feedlot as well as the fake meat, they both were showing a rise in terms of inflammation. Both were happening. So they said, you know, we saw no difference here. Our hypothesis wasn't correct. And then they went into some, you know, explanations for why that was the case. And I very much appreciated what they were saying, and was able to point out points that we're making right now, that you know, this nutrient density, how the food's raised, where it's raised, all those things are going to be very important to be considering in terms of inflammation and what's happening with the body. And, you know, so in their case, the plants, and I won't say too much more about the particulars, but so where did those plants come from? How were the plants raised that were made on the meat? All those things, it's not trivial in my mind what we're talking about. What people like to say, we are what we eat, and what we eat eats, and all those kind of things. Well, let's really make that real. Let's get down to what is that, and as we're saying and alluding to, and my friend and colleague, and I think you may have met him at the Grass-Fed Exchange, Stefan von Vliet. But Stefan's really running and gunning, and there's just a world of studies that can be done to try to explore this area. I think that it's really a worthwhile area of research, even given, as we were saying, that there's always limitations on research. But if you get into an area and you explore it well enough, and you're thinking holistically about it, you're not bogged down in the weeds, I think there can be some really nice contributions that get made. And I think in this area of diet diversity for animals and humans as well, and what that can do in terms of our health, that's a huge area, but I think very important. And then, as we're saying, the beauty to me is that it links things holistically. It's not just about, well, what did that cow eat? It's about where did that come from? What are the soils? I like to say, and I sound like a broken record, but I think plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for creatures below and above ground. To me, that sums up so much of the work that's going on. You can unpack all that, but if you want to look at life below ground, from the microorganisms to the macrofauna that's below ground, that's what plants do. It gives them homes, places to live, grocery stores, the nutrients they need, and pharmacies for them to keep themselves healthy when they get sick or need to self-medicate. And it's the same thing for creatures above ground, of course, as well. And if we tie into that, then, I know that can sound strange. And, if you're a medical doctor, going back to what you were talking about earlier, and you've had years and years and years of in-depth biochemistry, physiology, and on and on and on, I think sometimes, or a nutritionist who's done that, it may be hard to step back and think, well, bodies had to know how to do all this stuff, and then how can we enable that? Because there weren't such things as medical doctors or pharmacists, as I've said, or any of those things back in the day. So, and I know when we were first starting our research years ago, I wrote papers arguing that when we were first launching in and trying to make the case, this is worth studying, probably, the stuff that, well, how could it have been 10, 20,000, 50,000 years ago? How were they getting along without any of that? Well, there must be this knowledge. And how does that work? How is that working?
Like mushrooms. There's like what, 2 million kinds of mushrooms. Almost all are edible once. Very, very few are edible twice. How'd we figure that out?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most fascinating things on the planet. You talk about an interesting topic. It makes me think, and I'll wind around. There's studies done in ants, and they had poison taster ants, and they were a subset of the population that tasted these different things to see if they were toxic or not. Maybe we had poison taster humans. No, but that there were studies of poison taster ants, and I talk about it in Nourishment. But I think that's fascinating. How did people figure all that stuff out over the eons? I have a friend, Mike Huffman, who's very well known around the world for his work on self-medication in primates. And he's just done fascinating studies of the ability, how that works, and so forth. But he talks about in some of that what he's written, and he's worked a lot with indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, and about how one of the ways they learned about medicinal plants is by watching animals, wild animals that were sick, watching them and watching what they ate, and then sampling, trying some of that when they were in certain kinds of sicknesses. It's that's to me, that's just a fascinating topic. I think that would be, I swear I'm kind of done writing papers and stuff, but I think that that would be worth a paper of to try to get into how innovation and how that's all happened. And I'm sure people have written papers. I think of those. There's a video I like to show of an oyster catcher. It's down near a body of water and has a piece of bread. It's throwing the bread. It's standing on the shore, throws the bread in, grabs the bread, throws the bread in the water, grabs the bread, does it over and over again. And you're watching that. And then all of a sudden, wham, it got a fish comes out. It gets a fish. It's fishing. It learned to fish. So how did the oyster catcher learn to fish? It's those
Watching a
are
fisherman?
yeah, I don't know, and that's where goats eating wood rat houses, why do goats eat wood rat houses? That was, I was so fortunate to be able to see some of those things happening down there when we were working with the goats in southern Utah. We had in this first study, we had 6 pastures set up, 15 goats on each pasture, and goats in one pasture started to eat these wood rat houses. And I often tease people, well, maybe the Einstein of the goat world was in that pasture and it figured out that, if we eat these wood rat houses, but why were they doing that? Inside those houses are different rooms. And one of the rooms is the bathroom. And that bathroom is vegetation that's soaked in urine. Well, that was a non-protein source of nitrogen. And that's, if there's one thing that you could supplement with down there on that poor quality roughage, that poor quality shrub blackbrush, it would be provide them with a protein supplement to stimulate microbial populations in the rumen and to help them to better digest that poor quality forage. And by golly, those goats over the 3 months we had them on there lost way less weight than all the other goats and those other, I can't say that they gained a huge amount of weight. It's just that they fared far better than the goats that didn't do that. And over three winters with 18 different groups of goats, that was the only group ever figured that out. Now, if we'd have wanted all the other goats to be doing that, we'd have just had to take and experienced, the goats that had learned to do that, put them in the other pastures like that. They'd have all been doing that. And going back to the oyster catcher, I'm betting that other oyster catchers figured out how to fish watching that oyster catcher fish. But I'm bouncing around the fascinating topic that you raise of how do creatures in general and humans in particular, how did we figure out all these different things? And, all these secondary compounds that were historically in plants and serving multiple functional roles for plants, that we ended up using fossil fuels to do those roles, whether it's herbicides or pesticides or on and on. Plants were doing that. Well, people historically figured out ways to cook plants, to work with plants that reduce the concentrations of those compounds in plants. So that, to me, that was like, that was really clever that they figured out. Some of them, cassava, for instance, that could be outright toxic. They learned that, if you treat it with water and boil it and different things, that's where cooking can be so valuable. But they figured ways to deal with those compounds in plants and to be able to use them.
Like, how many people got sick before we figured out rhubarb?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. And rhubarb's loaded with oxalates. Not that we need to get into all these different compounds that are in plants, but that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So like I have a question down here about eating plant-based protein, and I guess that was kind of supposed to be rolled in there with that dialogue about fake meat. And I guess where I'm going at with this is epigenetic changes, whether we're talking about people, cattle, sheep, goats, whatever, from generations of, let's call it a high energy diet or a refined foods diet. Are we heading for, I'll just come out and say it, are we heading for a wreck in our human genome because of what we've been eating, like the industrialized, westernized, standard American diet? Is that going to could that cause some problems down the line for us as human beings epigenetically?
Yes, I think it already has. I think the wreck's already here, actually, when you look at the statistics, and I'm not trying to place shame or blame or anything else in that sense. It's kind of just the luck of the draw, however you end up on some of this. But, you know, realizing that these kind of changes begin in utero, early in life. If you're There is really a rich human literature on these kind of changes, and mothers who put on excess weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese when they're pregnant, mothers who are eating these ultra processed diets. Their poor child's born already well on its way to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. It's just, the wreck is already here when you look at the statistics, and when you look at that. I can't help but think, when I was growing up and sometimes look at pictures of people back in those days, they were so skinny, it's like they were emaciated. You just look at it and you think, whoa. And then you think nowadays, when you're in town or wherever you are, and you think, oh my gosh, we have just so gone down that other track. Now, the beauty of epigenetics is that it can change. Genes can be turned on and off. And so, if we get people off of the ultra processed diets, and back on to wholesome foods, and that's where the regenerative movement and all these, the wholesome foods have to taste good, right? They have to be good for you. You can't say. And reviewing the literature on the human literature when I was writing the book, it was so revealing and kind of humorous to, all the ways they think of to try to make vegetables more tasty to young kids. And the one way that was never talked about, it's like, well, let's get really good varieties, and let's grow them on great soils, and let's make stuff that let's try to shop locally. Because when you pick stuff and ship it, you're losing a lot of the nutrient density and phytochemical richness. And in a way, it's kind of, how do we go back to the old ways, in ways that can make us healthy? And you think of the cost to society. I deleted that from Nourishment. When I was writing the book, I had a whole chapter about plant wisdom, and then costs, weaving that in with costs to society. The costs are just enormous in terms of the monetary costs of obesity and diet-related diseases. It's an enormous cost that we're paying on all of that. But that is the
Well, that's
beauty
okay.
of
We'll just have healthcare for all. We'll just get healthcare
right,
for everybody.
which and we know, getting into those, boy, just break the system. There's not enough money on the planet to deal with that. So it's kind of, and that's where I appreciate what you're doing, Brian, and all this kind of, it's how do we get back to some of those old ways of appreciating growing your own food, purchasing locally from people who are, maybe you can't grow a cow or even your own eggs, but trying to get local, and trying to, if you can, even grow a few things yourself. Just, I think all that is very, very health promoting. We have some chickens here. Sue's, my my wife's got some chickens, and we're it's a long story, and I really won't go down that rabbit hole, but we shouldn't have them in this subdivision. We were able to work it, and so we've got, but they don't want them just free ranging across our property. So we'll let them out a couple times a day. And when people from who have no background in anything we're talking about are here, and we say, you want to come with us and return the chicken? They love it. They just, you would think they'd be bored stiff, but they think it's cool just watching those chickens go picking this and that, and then the grasshoppers when they get out going after the grasshoppers, and just kind of, it's kind of mesmerizing and fascinating for them to just to watch that. And it makes me think, that's something that's kind of deep inside of us, I think, in a way of, and they say it's relaxing doing that. And you think, yeah, it is just, and we've got 2 ducks. That's a long story too, I won't go into, but here's the point I want to make, is those ducks, and I never realized this, they are so tuned into the sky. The slightest thing, and it can be so minute, you can't see it, but when you see them tilt their head, there's something up there. And a lot of times it's an avian predator of one sort or not, or it could be a jet that's so tiny, but and the chicken, so now
the ducks are the early warning system for the chickens.
They are that, well said. And the chickens watch the ducks. We watch the ducks, and the minute they tilt, they never miss. They never ever miss. You may have a hard time to see it, but they never miss. And if the ducks start to run, boy, the chickens are on the run too for shelter. And it's just, I don't know. For me, that kind of stuff is fascinating. And then it goes, and so we built them this palace, this chicken palace, and we put a roost, a place in there for them to roost. And it's so interesting to see how they decide that roost isn't where they want to roost. They want to be in the rafters, and so just
sounds about right.
Little things, but yeah, but it's about, animals aren't machines, genes aren't destiny. Creatures are figuring things out, but you have to take the time to slow down to just watch them, whether it's cows out on your landscape or sheep or goats or chickens or oyster catchers figuring out how to fish or whatever it is. Creatures are clever. And back, not to beat it to death, but the fact that genes are being expressed, up and down regulated, gives hope, because it's like, it's not just ironclad into the genome that's it. We're bound to be an obese species. No, we can change those things, but that means changing the whole system. And that's I think the power of that whole regenerative movement in terms of health from the ground up, building health from the ground up.
It's one of the strangest things about modern society is that we have poor people or people in poverty that are obese. Like, never before has that condition existed in human history until just maybe the last 20 years.
That's right. That's absolutely the case. And, when I was in the human literature reading on those things, people, because people often argue, well, it costs less to buy ultra processed food. But even in the short term, it costs you more. But in the long term, then, as we're saying, boy, the cost to all of us, society is all of us, the costs are absolutely enormous. But you'll see as you go further into Nourishment, where I talk about some of those things and some very interesting examples that some of the people that write about humans and study humans have used to illustrate points about, no, it's far more costly to be eating the ultra processed food on many levels. But there again too, I'm thinking of one example with strawberry fruit gushers, which are basically sugar with an artificial strawberry flavor. There's not a hint of strawberry.
Sugar with sugar water inside.
That's it. And there's not a hint of a strawberry in that. And they're talking then about the difference in nutritional quality and what you're getting for those. But again, I think of strawberries that we buy, and a lot of times they just are so lacking in flavor compared to ones like we're growing here now that are coming on. And it's that whole idea of how do we raise food for people? And it seems like that's where the local becomes so important. Raise food for people that's really nutrient dense, phytochemically rich, from the vegetables to the fruits to the meats that we eat, and really get people hooked on really good wholesome foods. And then it was interesting to me to read in the anthropological literature about how back in the day, before a woman got pregnant, they really paid very close attention to the diet she was on and the diet that the father was on, the father to be was on, before they ever conceived. And it's like, boy, those people knew the importance of that in terms of they didn't know epigenetics or any of that, but they understood that that's important. That's important to health. And
They knew it. They just didn't have a word for it.
that's right. That's right. And I think this wholesome eating and stuff, bodies knew that, and peoples knew that, and it became parts of the culture. I often think that in the little town of Salida where I grew up, um, all those people that came over from Italy, the grandparents and great grandparents, they still had those traditions. They grew big gardens. They oftentimes had chickens. They Many of them raise a pig and stuff, and that they didn't let that go. They knew the value of really wholesome foods and growing them on rich soils. But then when I think to my parents' generation and then to my generation and on from that, we really lost that as a part of cultures. Those people took great pride. They could grow gardens that was amazing, with short growing seasons, and they took great pride in the gardens they grew and the animals they raised and so forth.
You got any theories as to why we lost that knowledge or why we decided to forget or quit practicing?
It's a good question. Probably multiple causes on that. I think, I remember when the first fast food place opened up in the little town of Salida. I mean, it's so common now, right? That you don't even think twice, but there was a time when all that was just getting started. And I think the industrialization of all those processes, and the things like Mark talks about in the Dorito effect, just gradually took us away from raising our own foods. I think also, as I've read, we thought that with all the modern technology and everything that we would work less, actually, right? We wouldn't have to work as much, but
That was the promise, wasn't it?
that was the promise. But now I think we're running so fast, and I often think, both husband and wives end up needing to work to try to make a living for the family. And so those things really take a back seat then. Who has time at the end of the day to come home and tend your garden and cook a home cooked meal and so forth? All that, I think multiple factors have caused that to disappear over time. And it happens incrementally, so nobody notices. All of a sudden, you've gone from here to you're clear over here. And how did we get here, like you're saying?
I feel like we've been tricked into living on too high of an energy budget.
I agree with you, Brian. I agree with you. And when that struck me more than anything else was I got on the faculty at Utah State back in 1981, and we built a house. We didn't have a lot of money, and so we didn't have anything extra. We had two kids, and we didn't have any extra money for certain. And so after we got this house built, I finished the basement, took the time to finish the basement, and I had a lot in that house. And we decided to move to Australia for a year. And we decided we'd sell the house. We need to sell the house and all our belongings. And the market dropped at that time. And so we got more than we owed on the house, but really took a hit in terms of all the work that I'd done on that house after
Didn't get
we,
the equity you thought you had.
yeah, didn't get the equity. And so we moved in. We had 6 months before we left for Australia, and we moved into a rental house that was really what I would consider kind of a dump. Compared to the house, it was kind of a dump. But I was in that house about 2 weeks, maybe a month at the most. And I thought, I love this dump. I freaking love this dump. I don't have any worries about my big house payment anymore. My family's with me. I thought I didn't own that house. That house owned me. Absolutely, that house owned me. Then we moved to Australia into an even kind of a worse of a dump. Old cast iron stove to cook on, like was in my grandmother's house and stuff. But after that year, and we loved it. We loved it. And after that year, we thought a lot about what you were saying. We're on this high energy budget, but we thought we don't need to do that. So we bought a piece of ground, 2.5, 3 acres, whatever it was. We were able to grow steer and a couple of lambs, huge gardens, and we built a very modest house. That was because we thought,
Is that when he
that
came back, or was that in
when
Australia?
we came back, yeah, when we came back from Australia, and we just thought, it depends how fast you want to run. If you want to run with the rats as fast as you can run on the high energy budget, just keep buying all this materialistic stuff, huh? Have a ton of cars, have big house, have all that stuff, and boy, but we thought, no, we're done with that. We paid that house off in 10 years.
Right on.
Yeah. So, I'm not trying to sound like the big whatever, but I mean, it's just, it was a realization to us that, you don't have to, you don't have to have big of anything. You can have modest, you can have, and not that the house that we built was big, but it's just, yeah, it's just,
But
I totally agree with what you're saying. We're on such a high energy budget, and we have all these things that we just have to have, right? That just keep you running so fast. And, and I think if trying to raise a family nowadays too, with all the things from cell phones to you name it,
the tyranny of the school activity calendar, I think, is what
yes,
somebody put it once.
oh, absolutely, and then you're caught, of how do you do that in ways so your kids don't feel like they're abused, but try to raise them in a way that not in these craziness. Yeah, none of that leads to happiness. That's the thing, huh? None of that leads to happiness.
My somewhat controversial viewpoint on education is that's the parent's job. And by delegating the raising and education of our children to the state, to the government, um, it, people talk about homeschooling as an experiment. And I think they have it completely backwards. Homeschooling is not the experiment. Homeschooling has been going on for thousands of years under maybe different names, but the experiment is government run schooling, and I don't think it's working.
That's absolutely the case. It's the same kind of story for the wisdom of the body, right? That's what that education was going on forever in terms of how to live in an environment, right? And it was the family and the extended families that we used to live in, that our ancestors lived in, families, extended families, clans, and so forth. And so, yeah, that's where the teaching was taking place.
Well, hopefully, as we go forward in time, we'll start rediscovering and reapplying that generational and ancient wisdom. Uh, and I hope we can do it before we get too far down this high energy path that we're on.
Yeah, that's what I often often think about and wonder about. I think that's exactly. Hopefully, that can happen. Yeah, absolutely the case. The other thing I think about a lot too is in that process of moving toward the education in schools and so forth, we moved away from the hands-on part. That's most people learn so much better with hands-on, the personal experience of something. And I often think we had a program going the last 10 years I was at Utah State called Behave. And we were had many different kinds of activities, but one of them was working with kids in schools and getting them out working in gardens, hands-on in gardens during the spring term of the year, and then they'd go off for summer, and then the fall, bringing them back and showing. But what a marvelous place. You can teach everything there, huh? You can get as detailed as you want, but it's real. And they loved it. They loved getting out, and they loved planting the seeds and talking about soil. And, in this teaspoon of soil, there's a cajillion different, microorganisms. But so, if you have the knowledge that you want to convey, whether it's at whatever level, out in the real world is such a holistic way to do that. It's really, and you could talk about all facets of systems when you're out there out there on a landscape, and it's to the degree that we've gotten away from that, I think we end up doing a disservice to our species.
I'd agree. We got to kind of wrap this up, Fred.
Let me make one other comment on that. I agree,
Okay.
and it ties back to with one other thing that you were saying. I'm thinking of and it's in the book, and it has to do trying to think where it was. It doesn't matter where it was in Africa, but it was about indigenous peoples. And the one group had stuck with the indigenous ways. So their knowledge of the 250 plants that were out there and all the different uses of those plants, not just in food and medicine, but in building and everything under the sun, they had kept that. Another tribe had lost that. The kids had become much more westernized. And this extended drought hit, like 10-year drought. The tribe that had stuck with the old ways, they weathered the drought really nicely. The other tribe didn't at all, because they'd let all that knowledge go. They had lost that knowledge. And the people who were writing about that said that the sad thing was the tribe that had kept that knowledge, their children now were becoming really enamored with the allure of the Western ways. And, it wasn't so interesting and so forth to be out there knowing all the plants and the animals and so forth and so on. And so they were lamenting that they were going to lose that kind of knowledge as well. And then when the next big drought hit or whatever, they were going to be in as sad a shape as the other tribes. So anyway, that's kind of linking back with some of the things that you were saying, and that knowledge, that knowledge of knowledge of the environments, and I think often we're members of nature's communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves, and by nurturing them, we nurture ourselves. But we've gotten so far away from that, and I think it's wonderful what you're doing to try to get people linked back in with that kind of knowledge. Brian, I'll say as a kind of a last remark, I appreciate very much.
Well, thanks for that, Fred. I think though a lot of what I'm doing is just, helping connect folks like you with a wider audience and having some deeper conversation and promoting, getting people to ask questions. That's what I want people to do. Ask the frickin' questions. Maybe don't always come ask me all of them, but there's a lot of important questions that we just don't ask as a society.
Oh, absolutely the case. And I think it's because, at least on the topics that we were on today, we've become so detached from that. Who would even think to ask any of those questions? Also, if you can stimulate a little bit of thought and so forth, then that gets conversations going. And with where, with all the challenges nowadays, ecologically, economically, socially, politically, some of that knowledge, like um, that comes from those farming and ranching and feet on the ground ways, that's dang important. I'm going to say one more thing, and then when I was at Utah State, we used to have wonderful conversations in the undergrad class that I was teaching about this, where we would dialogue about these kind of things. And there's a movie I used to like to show titled Power of Community, and it was about Cuba, and it was about what happened to Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed, when they fell. Uh, Cuba was absolutely dependent on the Soviet Union for oil, and all of a sudden that there was none. And they were an economy in free fall. And it was an amazingly uplifting story about how people working together were able to, I mean, it didn't matter how educated you were or whether, how many PhDs or medical degrees or whatever you had, people became regenerative farmers in a hurry across that country because they had to. It's like, okay, now we're back to basics. Now we're back to what really sustains you. And it was
I
a
think
great. It was a
listening to you
great.
talk about it, it sounds like it should be required reading for every U.S. citizen in the world in 2022.
No, honestly, it is. It's because, and it just showed, it showed the power of people pulling together too, that people actually faced with that challenge, they work together rather than pulling apart. But also, no more fossil fuels, so you couldn't rely on any of the things we rely on in industrial ag to do it. You had to become regenerative. Absolutely. It was wonderful to show that and to talk about that and to say, this could happen. Don't think this can't happen here in this country or any country. These kind of things can happen, and trying to get all of us thinking about, well, how what would you do, and how could we work together?
I'm thinking of there's a good quote at the beginning of the movie, The Big Short. You know the movie I'm talking about?
Oh, I loved The Big Short. I loved it.
So I think the quote is the most dangerous thing isn't what you think you know is going to happen. It's the thing that you know for certain can't, or something to that effect. It's
Yes.
like,
No. Yep. Absolutely.
oh, there's
Absolutely.
no way this will ever fail. It's too big to fail. It's too big to fail. Well, those are famous last words, I think.
Those are famous last words, and it reminds me of a very short book titled "Immoderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail." And that's absolutely it. It's the hubris and I was exposed to some of that too as I went along in different departments and stuff that were fabulous, world famous. And you get thinking you get the hubris and thinking that you're too big to fail or too good, where that could never happen to us. And boy, you're on your way. You're on your way. It's just, and that title's great. Immoderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail.
Well, I'll make sure I get that in the show notes along with every other book. And I think Ghost in Your Jeans, you said that was on Netflix
It
or YouTube.
probably is. I'm not sure. It's a Nova special, and
I'll
it's
find
out
it
there.
and make sure the link is in the show notes.
Oh, I tell you, I don't know how many times I've watched that movie, and it's as relevant today. It's been out, I don't know, maybe 15 years, but it's as relevant today as ever. And it's just gripping when you think about that. And they do a great job of explaining, going more into and interviewing state-of-the-art researchers in those days. And epigenetics influences every facet of our life. We were talking a little bit more about foods and those kind of things and diet-related issues, but everything from how calm you are as an adult to probably any facet of personality you want to talk about, all those things. And they make that come alive. They just make it come alive through all the examples they use. And it's focused on humans, of course. So that makes it very, very interesting for people to watch and understand.
Great stuff. Fred, I really appreciate your time today. I'm sorry about the confusion with, with time zone. I'll own all of that. So don't worry about it.
No, you don't have to own it. It's me. I'm old person, Brian. And I look on the when you brought that up, and I look on the thing right there. It shows 2 o'clock, starting at 2. But so much we had said 3 o'clock, so I'm thinking three. And but you know what? I've so enjoyed, honest to goodness. I'm sorry it took us so long to get to here, but I absolutely have 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 relished our conversation today. Great kind of yeah.
We're
And
gonna have to do it again.
as we talked in Fort Worth, let's just let it go wherever it goes. And I find that the most interesting, where you don't come in with any kind of ideas or agenda. You just goes where it goes. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, Brian. Not just saying that to be nice either or whatever. I mean it. It was wonderful, wonderful conversation.
I enjoyed you too, Fred. And once again, thanks for joining me. Gang, y'all have a great week.